Looking for someone, I guess I'm doing that.
Well, I think with Trespass is that we kind of feel is really the first kind of proper Genesis album. The Genesis Revelation stuff was songs we'd kind of written with the original intention of other people doing them, and no one else would do them, and then we sort of modified them a bit so they fit this kind of broad concept we had, and then just recorded them while we almost just left school. Very simple. We never played live or anything, and I played mainly piano on it and stuff. By the time we did Trespass, we'd been playing on the road for a few months, and we had obviously about an hour and a half's worth of material, and we just recorded what we thought were the sort of better ones for Trespass. I think we were sort of influenced, obviously in the early days we were very influenced with the Beatles, Beach Boys, Kinks, all that sort of stuff, which produced, which is still sort of very, very influenced on us throughout our career. But by that time we'd heard groups like Family and the Procol Harum album, Shine On Brightly, and Salty Dog, and Fairport Convention, and the way they were doing things interested us. It just showed slightly different approaches. You weren't trying to write hit songs, trying to sort of make music sort of do a little bit more than that, and this appealed to us. And the idea of having a bit more room to breathe, songs creeping up to sort of 7-8 minutes, just seemed a lot more exciting to us, and the idea of being able to develop. Fairport Convention influence and the acoustic guitars was quite a big thing. And Phillips and Mike, used to play these two guitars together, and they do a lot of interweaving sort of parts and the harmonies they created between them, which was very much a sort of part of early Genesis, and strong part of it actually, and certainly led to the start of what was probably the best song on this album, which is Stagnation, I think, which is starts off as an acoustic thing, which was a little idea of Mike and Ants, and then it developed by the whole group into a sort of a bigger piece. But it was a very I think that was quite unique. In fact, no one else really sort of was quite doing that, but it did come from that sort of Fairport sort of roots, I think. Some of the songs there developed out of things that we'd written as in sort of the way we used to write, which Ant and Mike writing together and Peter and I writing together. The Knife particularly was the thing Peter and I sort of put together, and then we kind of developed it in the studio. I'm looking for someone's like that as well. And then obviously things like Dusk and White Mountain on this album came more from the Ant and Mike side. Visions of Angels was a song that was left over from Genesis Revelation, which we then developed and made a bit more of to make it into a big live song. So, I think we were starting to write as a group, but it's still some vestiges of the individual writing there. I mean, looking back on the album, I like, it's not, I think it was a pretty good, well, I call it first album, it's really a second album, I suppose, pretty good for where it comes in the thing. And I think Stagnation is great, and I'm probably looking for someone. The other songs on the album, don't quite do as much for me anymore as they once did, I mean, I always felt Dusk was a bit of a B track. It sounds okay. And White Mountain used to do that live, and that was quite nice live as well, quite atmospheric. But it was not, I don't think it's as strong as what was to come. It was a very rushed sort of thing. You went in there, you had a sort of day or two to do it in. It was quite quick thing. And I mean, I remember being quite nervous really doing, you didn't want to make any mistakes because it wasn't the ability you have now of sort of going back and repairing and overdubbing and stuff. The whole band went in there and we all played it, and you went on and did a take until you got something that was halfway decent from all of you, particularly the drums, because that was the one you really couldn't do anything about. Some of the other stuff you could, but it was, I just remember going in there and just playing the songs. But we were pretty well, we played them on the road, as I say, for a few months, and we were pretty much okay on them, I think, and we just played them pretty much as we'd done them on the road. The Stagnation developed out of a piece that we'd had rather pretentiously called The Movement, which we'd been rehearsing for sort of like for a long time before we played it on stage or anything. And it developed. This thing at one point was about 30 minutes long, and it sort of got condensed, and bits came and bits left, but the first bit stayed, so it was always a sort of key song for us. Peter used to play a lot of flute, really. It was nice for us to have an instrument. You must understand, in those days, obviously, keyboards meant just organ and piano, really. That's all there was. And I sort of got a fuzz piano going, piano through a fuzz box, which got some good sounds on it. But the flute, which Peter played, was a very strong thing. And he wasn't a great flute player, and he would never say he was, but it was a lovely touch in there. And and things like Stagnation is the melodies, the big melody at the end, the sort of riff that carries on and on, starts off as a flute thing, and it's a really nice thing, and it was a really nice quality to have in there, I think. Obviously later, once the sort of mellotrons and everything came in and synthesizers, we sort of it went by the wayside, but it was. It also gave Pete something else to do when we were writing songs. I mean, he didn't just sort of sing, we were banging tambourines and the rest of it. Obviously sometimes it gets a bit frustrating, I think, for him, because he was, he was a person who'd like to have had his hands on the keys quite a lot of the time, but I wouldn't let him, So he could play the flute, and then that would be a nice way of writing it. It would give one a sort of another dimension to the sound.
Tell me my life is about to begin. Tell me that I'm a hero. Promise me all of your violent dreams. Light up your body with anger.
Well, The Knife was a very popular stage song. And we used to construct our set in those early days. One thing we used to start acoustic, and I used to play a lot of guitar. And it would start with the first 2 or 3 songs I'd play guitar on, and then with Stagnation would be the first sort of song that had anything else in it. And of course that song itself develops, starts off with just the guitars, and then the keyboards come in, and there's even an organ solo, and then the whole thing becomes drums and everything come, and there's a big thing at the end. So, and then The Knife was the kind of final song in the set. And it always got the audience that. They always loved it. It was that sort of the rhythm, it was just sort of always, even people who weren't sort of quite sure what we were on about, they heard that and their heads were all going, So it was a key song for us in those early days, and it became very much, I think, for that first sort of year or two we were touring, the key song, the trademark Genesis song.
I'll give you the names of those who must kill. All must die with their children. Carry the heads to the palace of old. Hang them high, let the blood flow. In peaceful shades of green.
Our relationship, obviously, with Peter was a very close friend of mine at school, and Mike were the same, and then we sort of coming together there. And obviously on this album we had John Mayhew as the drummer, who was the person who was actually our third drummer. Someone we picked up really through through ads and stuff and everything, and we were sort of slowly getting some cohesion going, I think, between the 5 of us in that way. It was quite difficult for John, I think, because we'd all been to the public school and behaved a certain kind of way, I think, which must have been very irritating to him, I'd have thought. It was very close, but we used to fight an awful lot, terrible arguments and shouting matches and going off. I was probably the main instigator of that kind of stuff. We argued a lot because we were passionate. Also, we were young, sexually frustrated. I don't know, all sorts of reasons we were. It was just one of those things. We did feel intensely about it, really, and you find yourself, you look back on some of the arguments you had were just about sort of pretty trivial things, but when you're close to people like that and you're living on top of each other, little things can trigger an argument. It's just about nothing at all. And that's first, the cottage period when we were just all living together, we weren't even hardly taking weekends off or anything. It was quite a strain on those people who did actually have relationships. So it was kind of it was difficult, but it was intense. But it had some great moments there too, and I remember it being as a sort of mixed period, really, some great moments and some violent moments. It was a difficult period with some great moments and some awful moments, to be honest, during the writing period of this and everything. But then once we started playing on the road, it got a bit, once you started some audience response, it all started to sort of make sense a little bit, really. I went to university for a year, in fact, and then sort of took a year off, and then took another year off. And I think my parents always hoped I'd go back. And I knew that I felt this was an opportunity that would only come. You get opportunities. It was one that was there, and I thought about not doing it. And then I thought I really would miss this. I really, really want to do this as a chance, And at that time it was an incredibly slim chance, as you must understand. And so we just sort of slowly, we were able to do it. I think back in that period of time, 1970, there were an awful lot of clubs and things you could play where a band like us could just play support, probably, to some other group, in front of maybe 80, 90 people, maybe less. When we headlined, we were playing to sort of, sometimes a little sort of 5 or 6 people. I mean, that's what you were doing, But you had a chance to learn your craft, and you could actually... You just about could get enough money to keep yourself going. Anthony, for me, was kind of the group leader. He was the one who wanted to go live. He was the one who wanted to go professional. He kind of motivated the rest of us really to do that. Peter and I were not sure at all that's what we really wanted to do, but he was the one who wanted to do it. And initially, I think we almost stayed. The first summer we started doing this. We did it because we were a 4, and we sort of did it before with the intention that we probably wouldn't stay and they would find somebody else, And then, of course, we got more into it and everything after that. So we were very surprised, then Anthony was the one who sort of seemed to suffer from stage fright and everything, and that kind of, in a sense, was sort of perhaps ultimately the reason why he left. But there was no feeling that he was going to leave at this point. So it was a very sort of difficult thing. And I mean, at this point, we were very definitely looking ahead, for that this was the group. Well, it was quite a nice idea. We saw the music we'd done. A lot of it was very sort of pretty and romantic music. We had this one song, The Knife, which was anything but, a sort of violent song. So we just pictorially did that. We said to this guy, just draw a fairy drawing and then knife slash through the middle with a knife sticking out the end of it. And it was sort of, I think it's quite good really, because it's deceptive, Genesis, sometimes. You sort of see them as one thing, but in fact there's this other thing going on right from the early days, I think. And we've always had those two sides to us, sort of, it may vary a little bit really as to how you define them, but the sort of romantic side and the sort of more aggressive side, it's a very important part of what we do. And so I thought that particular cover actually was really good, because it was, it was supposed to be a kind of like a cliched sort of fairy story kind of like cover, and then with this knife on it, which did something special, I think. Best of the early covers, I think, in many ways. Well, best of the first three covers, anyhow. Well, Trespass was a big advance for us from Genesis Revelation. We'd been playing live for a while, and I think it was the first album where we start to play as a group. We actually know what we're doing, and everything sort of starts to coalesce. Really, it's in its position in the Genesis thing, it was very important. It was a kind of like, because it set the trend, I think, of what was to come later. It's definitely the first of the Genesis albums as people came to know them, and from that point of view, it's very important. I think we still had a bit to learn, and I think one or two of the songs in there, perhaps a little bit slight in comparison with what was to come later. But at its strongest moments, which, as I said before, I think Stagnation, I think it's right up there. Anthony Phillips left, and so we had to make the decision. I originally thought, when Anthony, as I said before, I think I saw him as group leader in many ways, certainly the most influential person in the group. And I thought when he left, we probably would split up, actually. And then we had a conversation. Mike and Pete were very keen to carry on, and Richard McPhail, who was our roadie but a good friend and a sort of a big fan and everything, said there's no way you must carry on. You've really got something going here. So all these things came together, and we had a meeting, and we decided that we probably felt we could do better on the drums. That we liked John and everything. He was good, but he wasn't. Just felt we could have someone more creative in the drum seat. So we had to make this decision. And so then we were just auditioning, for a guitarist and a drummer. The guitarist was more of a problem. In fact, we went out as a four-piece for about 2 or 3 months, I think. And which taught me a lot, because I ended up playing all this piano I put through a fuzz box, that I played all the guitar parts that Ant had played. Well, all ones I could anyhow, on that, at the same time I was playing the organ part. So I was doing this two-handed stuff, which I'd never sort of really done before, but it made me mature as a musician, great amount. And although it was probably never great, the four-piece thing, we did get it so it wasn't too bad. And we started writing this, we did this piece, which became the musical box, which we started as a four-piece. And it sounded, we knew this was really good. We used to play it on stage and stuff as a four-piece, it was good. We had a guitarist very briefly, a guy called Mick Barnard, who came in for a month or two, and he was actually good, but he just probably wasn't assertive enough, And while that really wasn't working, we then, we auditioned Steve. Peter and I actually went to audition him because Mike was having trouble finding. He was always looking for someone to replace Ant, I think, which he was never going to be able to do because he was a good friend and everything. So we said, right, we'll find a guitarist. So we went and auditioned Steve, and we were really impressed with him. We really liked the way he approached things. It was just different. It wasn't entirely the same as us, but he played these things. His brother playing flute and him playing these things on guitar, which were quite slightly more classical style, perhaps, than we were used to. But we just thought he had a lot of imaginative ideas, and he didn't want to be a sort of mad guitarist. We weren't looking for. Most guitarists either wanted to be lead guitarists, sort of teeth, or else they were just purely acoustic guitarists and weren't interested in either of those extremes. We wanted someone who could cover both ends. So Steve was a very important addition.
Away from me, cold-blooded woman, your thirst is not mine.
Well, Phil and Steve's contribution, particularly at this stage, I think, was to bring a big musicianship into the group. I think, Mike and I, well, I mean, I was still learning very much as a musician. I mean, I was, it was okay, but nothing brilliant. And Mike was certainly still finding his way, I think, as a musician. Whereas Phil was he was a really high quality drummer right from the word go. He's got a great, brilliant sense of rhythm. And Steve, obviously, he was technically a better player than than we were at that time, I think. And that's what it really gave us, a bit of that sort of ability to sort of a bit of technique in there as well as everything else. Gave us a better chance to do things. I mean, for me, the contribution from Phil on the drums is what transforms it really, and you particularly coming back to them and remixing them, just suddenly everything has a sort of lilt. It works in a way that it didn't. It was a bit stiff on Trespass, some of those things. And you listen on Nursery Cryme, and even there's those sort of complicated songs like the Giant Hogweed, they sort of have a much better flow about them, I think, for that reason. And Phil's other contribution, obviously, which we were aware right from the word go, was the fact that he could sing. The rest of us sort of made vague attempts at doing backing harmonies, which were okay. But with Phil, we actually had someone who had a really strong voice as well. So, and Phil and Pete used to do quite a lot of stuff singing in unison as well as stuff in the harmony work. And Phil was also very good at just picking out little harmonies, sort of a la sort of Crosby, Stills and Nash and things like that. Just little ideas would come to him like that. So they weren't contributing much as writers at this stage, either of them. But it was very much more musicians, which in a way we were quite happy with because we had quite enough material.
I heard the old man tell his tale.
Writing Nursery Cryme, we got together in Tony Stratton Smith's house and put all these and just started writing really and pooling ideas and things, and it was easier writing, say, than it was in Trespass, but it still wasn't that easy, I suppose.
And I want, and I feel, and I know, and I touch.
I think it created that sort of fantasy, the lyric relating, to all this sort of the old Victorian kind of quality it has, and the album cover, which related obviously to that as well. It was a very atmospheric piece, and it was musically interesting, and it went through all these changes and that stuff. It was a sort of precursor, perhaps, of what was to come later. You have the little bits, and not a lack of repetition in the song. You can start off with one bit, which is a really strong section, that opening part, but it never comes back again, And we used to quite like doing that. We used to just like using a bit once and then going to a very loud bit and then a very quiet bit and another loud bit and then a sort of serene bit. And by using the contrasts, I think it's a sort of song that has about a lot of contrasts in it, which, again, is for some people is very appealing. And some people just find it irritating because it means it never settles into a groove, just sort of, you're doing one thing, this is great, it's stopped again, they're going off, time change and everything. But, so it is a very sort of typical Genesis song, sort of that. It followed on from Stagnation, I suppose, that same kind of thing, but perhaps a little bit more dramatic. Musical Box obviously was, as I said, developed out of us playing as a four-piece, and I think it also developed out of really right from the early days of the playing with Ant and Mike, and so it had that sort of two-guitar thing, and I play guitar on it as well at the front, so the first part of it is all guitar. And we sort of, a few ideas came out of that. But I think the real strength of the song comes towards the end, really. This little sort of bit that starts, She's a Lady, and then the organ comes in playing this little sort of fugue type thing, which I originally saw as instrumental, I have to say. I thought, this is really good, and then we did it. And then Pete suddenly, we were doing the vocals, and I said, so he's finished now, and then suddenly he started singing on this bit, and I thought, shit, he's singing all over my bit. And I must admit, initially I wasn't too sure about doing that at all. And in fact, when we did the mix of the album, we mixed the voice too low. But on stage when we started playing this, I realised just how strong that was, because it was like what I played was still there in a sense, but the vocal just gave it that real sort of capping quality, I think, and it was a real standout moment on stage, I think. It's not my favourite moment, I have to say, but his voice sounds very nice, very pure. He sort of has more of a sort of James Taylor sort of quality in those days, right, before he got this great bit of the rasp that was to come later. But it showed that he had it. I think because he had a nice voice, we thought it would be great to sort of feature it as a solo thing, and that was it, and Pete was quite happy with that, Just showed another side to the group, I think, a little bit, really. But as I said, it was more in the contributions really where he's singing, with Peter. I think that it's a more of a Harold the Bower, for example, where they sing the whole thing as a duet, sing it together. In fact, they're actually mixed on the tape. You can't separate them. We thought it might be nice to sort of, because it sounds sometimes it sounds a little Phil biased. I think that song.
I'm standing in a doorway on the main square, tension is mounting.
I had this piece that I'd written when I was at university, which is just this little organ part, really, quite a simple little rundown. And I started developing it once we decided to buy a mellotron. That was it, because we really wanted. I loved the sound, and we had used a little bit on Trespass, and we loved the first Crimson album, which had used it obviously very extensively. So we went and bought one of the ones off King Crimson actually, and I sort of this little riff I'd started off at. In university, I then tried it was using the mellotron and the organ, and it really developed these great big swells on this thing, and it sounded fantastic. And so that was Fountain of Salmacis, and we then developed from that sort of opening part into a complete song out of that, which was a lot of jamming from the rest of the group and everything. But it produced a very, I think, a sort of strongly romantic thing, a lyric, obviously, sort of based on the myth of Salmacis.
Conquest, he found himself within a glade he'd not beheld before. Where are you, my father?
I almost prefer this cover coming back to it than I did at the time, in a funny way, looking at it. It's difficult for me to see. It's so much part of my past and youth, and I've signed so many copies of these things that you sort of see them all the time now. So it's rather difficult to have an objective viewpoint. But I think it's a strong image, and with the sort of the lawn stripes and everything, it gives a very strong feeling, and it fits well with the idea of the title and that association with the musical box.
The flame still summer lingers on, though her picture soon shall.
Well, Nursery Cryme obviously was the album that incorporated Phil and Steve into the band, and I think that we became, for that reason, perhaps a better playing unit than we've been in the past, really. And we'd also, by this time, played quite a lot on stage, and so I think the development from Trespass was quite a big one. And we had the ability, the mellotron was the new instrument in that album and everything, and so a sort of certain quality of what people came to think of that early Genesis sound was very much, I think, started with this album, probably more than with the previous one. I think going to Foxtrot was, well, we were pretty confident in what we'd written and everything. I think we had trouble with engineers and producers on this. I think Charisma were very keen for us to use this guy, Bob Potter, who'd worked with Lindisfarne. And because they wanted us to sound, I don't know what they wanted really, but they wanted the voice louder, I think was what they wanted more than anything else. And they thought a real producer coming in might be the sort of thing we had. So we went into the studio with this guy, Bob Potter, and I played, we started recording stuff, and I played the opening to Watch for the Skies. He said, I don't like that. I don't think we should use that. So I thought, oh God, here we go, And so in the end, I said, well, no way. And we tried a couple of other things, and he was okay as an engineer and everything. It was fine. It was good engineer, actually, nothing wrong with that. But the fact he didn't like what we were doing meant that we couldn't work with him. So we got rid of him and ended up working with just the engineer. And in fact, we changed engineers in the middle of the song because the engineer we were working with, we weren't too sure about him either. We recorded the first half of Supper's Ready with this other engineer. And then we got this other guy, John Burns, came in as the next engineer, and we finished off the song with him and did the rest of the album with him. On the whole, this album is one that, is probably my favourite of the, as a totality of the early albums, I think. I just think it's got sort of, we really came of age of this album, I think, and it got to number 12 on the charts, which was a staggering thing for us. So we were quite excited by that. I think we were writing better together as a group. I mean, a lot of the stuff, individual, stuff was still there. You come into the group. I mean, I tend to remember on this album, you come in with ideas, a riff or something. And like I mentioned at the beginning of Supper's Ready, but also that applies to, what became the end section of Supper's Ready. It was another thing I'd written. In fact, the thing I'd written on guitar at university, as it turned out, the As Sure as Eggs is Eggs thing. And so you had these sort of quite specific bits, like Willow Farm was Peter's and things, and we had these quite big just chunks that were all written by people. Kind of put them all in the same song, and then it was the kind of filling out stuff that almost ended up being the strongest stuff, though. You know, like the Apocalypse part, which was something that really was Mike, Phil, and I just wrote that, improvising, working out a big keyboard solo together, and the sort of way of playing it. So yes, I think we were writing well as a group together. And then the individual bits that came in, we just developed them more. I was very free with them. Sometimes, in the early days, perhaps, with the song Timetable, for example, I came in with a complete piece and just said, right, this is it, and we did it. Whereas something like Get 'Em Up by Friday, I just had this riff, this dang, 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 dang thing, and played it to them, and then we sort of developed it as a group. And that was sort of, in a sense, was more interesting, I think, and that's why, So I think it both ways work, but I think they're slightly more interesting when the group can all feel they're involved in the composition. It tends to produce a better result. We weren't quite sure what we'd written really until we heard it back, because we'd sort of heard this long thing. We decided we were really going to go for the long one this time because we'd done Musical Box and Stagnation. I thought, well, let's just go for one whole side of an album, 26 minutes. And see what we can do. And we got these ideas, and we actually sort of put bits and pieces in the thing. I mean, this song had started off just like Stagnation, really, in a way. I had this guitar piece I'd written, which I thought was a really strong opening part, which was kind of the first 2 or 3 minutes of the song was based on this part. And we started doing a thing on it, and got the sort of melody and everything. It was sounding really good, and we're carrying on. And it was developing, it was doing little tinkly bits after that, and all the rest of it, and a few vocal bits. And I thought that if we do this, could just be ending up sounding exactly like Musical Box. We're not careful, So I said, well, let's just stop the song. We had a really romantic bit. I said, let's just stop the song now and go straight into this other piece we have, which is Willow Farm, which is the thing that Peter had written. So let's just go in there. You've got this really pretty bit, and it's really ugly chord sequence suddenly coming in after that. Should sound great. And so we did that. And then that suddenly took the whole song to another dimension. Suddenly the drums were in, everything was going, and the second half of the song becomes very electric, and I think produced what was our best piece of composition during the period with Peter, which was the latter part of Supper's Ready, particularly from the Apocalypse in 9/8 onwards. It was just, and it was a coincidence to some extent what happened there again. It was another of those places where I had this a keyboard solo, and it ended on these big chords, and I thought, yeah, just big chords, I had this idea of just sort of vocal harmonies going, and then again Peter started singing on top of it, and I thought, oh shit, here he goes again, and I thought, when I heard it back, it really didn't take me very long this time. I thought, that sounds fantastic, and it was the real peak, you sort of had this long build up with this keyboard solo, which sort of like starts very sweet and then gets slightly more sinister, and then suddenly this big chord comes in, and then 666 comes in like that. Incredibly strong moment, I think. And I think for the early fans, it was the big moment, and on stage it was tremendous. It was a really, really strong moment, I think. And Supper's Ready was. It needed all the extra stuff at the front. It's like foreplay. You had to have all that stuff at the front to get to that one moment, I think, and then from then on it kind of really delivers. So it was. I was very proud of that. When we first heard it back, having written it and recorded it, we hadn't heard it all back. We actually stuck it together. When Mike and I going to another studio, because we ran out of studio time, and actually sticking these two parts together, which incidentally actually was slightly out of tune, so we had to do this sort of funny little slowed down the track in order to make it work, which we were able to rectify this on the remixes, obviously. And just hearing it back all as one thing, I thought, this is fantastic. This is so much the best thing we've ever done. I'm really excited by this. So that was a very strong moment. It's funny because it's not kind of quoted as much as it used to be. I mean, back in the 70s, I remember they used to have these sort of polls. I remember on it was Nicky Horn's show on Capital Radio, and the number one sort of rock track of all time was Stairway to Heaven, inevitably, I suppose. But number two is Supper's Ready. Well, that wouldn't happen now. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is because Supper's Ready never gets played because it's too long. No radio station is going to play a song that's 26 minutes long, is it really? So and that applies even in England. So it's not really known about much by people apart from people who know the group and like the group, and who bought the album, I suppose, and the live shows that we did with it. So it's a little bit forgotten, but I think it was a very strong moment. We were always tempted to try and do it on stage, but It is 26 minutes of a show, and that's an awful lot to give over to one piece from that period. The second best song is definitely Get 'Em Out by Friday for me on this album. I mean, I think that's a much better song than Watch with the Sky. So the introduction is a sort of, is a kind of a bit of an iconic sort of piece, I suppose, with Genesis. But it's, people forget about the other ones. I mean, but I don't know. I know a lot of people who think Can You Sit It in the Coastline is one of their favourite tracks, So I think I think every piece on this worked pretty well. It's strong. I mean, the end section of Can You Sit It is really good. I think it's sort of the first part's good. It's a really good song, and then it's just a bit fragmented, that song. I think that's where it suffers slightly. But the last part is a good instrumental piece as well. So, I just said before, I feel this album is strong all the way through.
Skimming by as eyes of the past.
Well, I thought this was the weakest of the album covers he did, certainly at the time. I mean, you come back to it now again, it's rather difficult to view it as a sort of, objectively. I don't, the mockery of the hunt sort of thing, it seemed a bit of a cliche and everything. I didn't sort of think, and it was sort of his idea to kind of do what he did, and it doesn't really relate to anything on the album, So it was all a bit of a thing, but we managed to make it kind of make sense by giving the album the title Foxtrot, sort of helped to kind of. To rationalise it a little bit. But I don't think we were terribly happy with it, to be honest. It was just one of those things that, as a group, we weren't that happy with. I know a lot of other people think it's good, but not so much for me. Well, Peter had started, as I said before, really trying to find things to do on stage, and she developed into wearing these kind of, the masks and everything, which on Suppers really worked really well. I mean, the flower idea was, at the time it seemed a bit crass, but it just worked so well, As I said, it happened at that point I was talking about in Suppers Ready, where the music went from pretty to silly, and he just sort of suddenly said a flower and stuck this thing on his face, and it was a great musical moment.
A flower? If you go down to Willow Farm.
We realised, the story is that, we did it and we weren't sure about it. We were happy enough with it in a way, but the next week he was on the front page of Melody Maker, so we thought, this is interesting. People often think it was the other way around, that the sort of he was depicted on the cover, but of course he just dressed up, which is funny in a way, because we weren't too sure about that album cover, so, but it sort of made sense when you only did it, suddenly he dressed up, turning up like that. And I can't remember exactly what I thought at the time, really. I mean, it was probably didn't approve to begin with, but then got used to the idea.
Hey, my baby, don't you know our love is true?
Well, Foxtrot was the first album to sort of, I think, where we kind of sounded sort of convincing to the outside world. I think we sort of convinced ourselves with the first two albums, and convinced maybe our fans. And I think Suppers Ready just took it on slightly another level, where people could hear this album who had never heard Genesis before and be interested in it. And I think that was a significant moment. And it was, as I said, it was a minor hit. I mean, it wasn't a big hit, but it certainly was sold a lot more than its predecessors had. We used to have writing sessions. We didn't necessarily write sort of all in one go, but quite a lot of Sailing Inland was written in one place. And I remember funnily enough, on this particular record, we were a bit stuck for ideas. We had two or three things that we knew we had. There was this riff that Steve had been playing on stage and all over the place, which we all thought was really good. And we knew we wanted to do something with that. And we developed that into the song I Know What I Like. And it was a quite simple thing, which was quite good for us, really. But we just thought it had a very strong atmosphere. So there's that. And then I had these three bits I'd written, which I originally assumed would go into different songs. But I think probably because the others sort of wanted my stuff sort of a kind of a Banks ghetto, they all ended up in the same song, which ended up being Firth Fifth. And I really just strung the three bits together and made sense of them in a way to make them good. And so those were written, and then we wrote this sort of riff that became the first part of Battling Epping Forest. Other than that, we didn't really have much else. It was kind of like we were struggling a bit for finding things. So we ended up playing these three things sort of every day for a long time, and kind of overworked, particularly Epping Forest. I think we overworked it. This album was sort of commercially, it sort of came in at number 3 or something. I think I Know What I Like did help. It was a sort of very minor hit. It did sort of get played on the radio a bit and everything. So I think suddenly, but I think also what had happened was that with the live performance, we were picking up fans all the time. And so when the next album came out, suddenly a lot of people went out and bought it all at the same moment, which gave you a bit of chart presence. And we always went down. The second week was always sort of like 3, and suddenly it was down to sort of 25. But it made you feel that you'd sort of got somewhere. It was stable. I mean, it felt stable too. I mean, Phil and Steve had very much sort of like I found their feet within the group. I think both particularly as players, and even Steve was a little bit starting as a writer, although it was still quite early days for him, really. So it was a more integrated sort of thing. It was, still probably, in all honesty, it probably was still three, the senior and junior members, but that was sort of to slowly change as time went by. Obviously, apart from the Firth of Fifth, really, most of the other things were things that were emerged in the studio to a large extent, and the development I would like was very much in the studio. I think we liked. We always felt that sort of the strongest moments seemed to some reason either come out of us all improvising and jamming and just sort of things coalescing. Really, we always liked that very much, and that's what gives you the thrill as well. You're playing along and seeing what might happen, but. This obviously, from my own personal point of view, was the first time I'd ever used a synthesizer as well. So it was quite a big move for me. They had this instrument, this Art Pro Soloist thing, which was quite a very simple monophonic synthesizer, but it had quite a nice little range of tones on it. And it was one you didn't have to sort of do any programming. It just was preset sounds, which was nice for me. And obviously the Cinema Show is very much based on that. But I used it throughout the album on little bits and pieces, and it was a really interesting addition to the sort of armoury, having got the... Also, these days I was also organ, piano and mellotron. But to have something alternative to play lead on like this, was suddenly, that opened up possibilities for me. And these little spring keyboard these things had as well, it was very easy to play. It certainly opened up my playing possibilities. I used to try and do everything I could with the Hammond organ. I'd sort of, you put it through fuzz boxes, wah boxes, switch it on and off. You try using one drawbar, one, or just the percussion sound. You try to get every little thing you get out of it. So you're using 100% of the instrument, is the way I was looking at it. Whereas now with a modern synthesizer, if you use kind of, 1/2 of 1%, you're doing well, I think, because they can do so much. A lot of people just switch on and use presets, and that's all they ever do. So it was. It really opened up the possibilities. The mellotrons were great to an extent, in the sense that they gave you these lovely string sounds and voice sounds and everything, but you couldn't play fast on them or anything. They were just big banks, they were such a crude instrument that when the synthesizers came in, it just opened up the keyboard world so much.
There's always been Ethel. Jacob, wake up, we got to tidy your room now.
We're always associated with heavy, progressive group and all that, but we came into the business writing pop songs, and it's something we'd always loved. And we were really pleased we'd actually written one that we thought was pretty good. And probably would have been quite a big hit if it hadn't sort of had this wardrobe in the title, which no one can understand. It was just a really nice sort of effect. It just developed very well, chorus very strong. And there's some other songs on this which were not quite as... I probably don't have quite so much time for this album as the previous one, purely because I'm not quite so fond of some of the things. After the Ordeal was just the track I really don't like. I've never liked it. And I would have liked it not to have been on the album, but it was sort of, in the end, we compromised by putting everything we had on. And there's Dancing Moon at Night, which I like. I like the way it starts very much, but it's not my favourite song, although I know a lot of people like it very much, but it's a slightly weaker track for me.
For her merchandise, he traded in his prize.
Firth of Fifth was, obviously it's a kind of like a very strong sort of keyboard moment from the early years. And the way the guitar solo evolved is quite interesting, really, because I'd written, the 3 bits, and the second bit I'd written was just really a flute and piano melody, and I'd just seen it as that. And we were playing it, we played it a few times, it sounded really nice. And then one time Steve said, started playing it, and he started playing it sort of like this, and I thought, oh great, and I started to put the mellotron in big chords like this. And it was almost like a joke. We were kind of doing it sort of like a la King Crimson is how we saw it. I was just doing this overblown thing. And I thought, that actually sounds really good, this. So we then sort of, so for the reprise of that melody when it came in the second half of the song, we said, well, let's do it this big way and see how it works. And it worked really well. And it gave a chance for Steve to actually do a sort of proper guitar solo. Steve, I think, was starting to really sort of find his feet a bit more as a player live and everything. Obviously he always contributed you know, a lot of Genesis music obviously required sort of guitar, sort of acoustic guitar picking and stuff, where people notice it less, I think. People tend to notice lead playing a little bit more, and I suppose on this it was more of a genuine guitar solo. Some of the others are a bit tricksy, you know, he's kind of thinking very hard about every note he played, and so it doesn't sort of soar in quite the way that this does, where I think he, you know, allowed himself to actually have a bit more freedom, you know, with it. Particularly before the main melody starts, just some really nice little phrases and stuff, you know, so it sounds more like a real guitarist.
Home from work, our Juliet clears her morning meal.
The other song on this album, I suppose, that kind of was a big development for us again was the cinema show, which was another one of those things that starts off with a sort of quiet, you know, acoustic beginning and then ends up doing something else at the end. But I think the instrumental at the end of this was probably the best of the ones we did at this stage in our careers anyhow. Mike had this riff, which was just in 7, just going dang, 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 like that. And he was playing along. And, you know, and I'd sort of just started fiddling around on top of it. And then we thought this could be really good. So again, Phil, Mike and I just went off really and put this all together and worked on all these bits. And I just improvised for hours and got the little bits and pieces going. Then Mike would change the chords. And we ended up with this piece. And I think it's, you know, it's just, well, it's such a strong rhythm in the first place. A lot of the things you play on it could be really good, but I got 1 or 2 quite good melodies on top of it, and it again built up to a very nice sort of climax, I think, and probably better on stage than it was on the album in many ways. But it was on the album it sort of fades out into the next bit, which I'm not too sure is quite so good. But it was an exciting thing to have created at the time. I think we were very pleased with it. We had tea on her lawn, but what was great was she just put the table was on the lawn like that. You know, and she put sort of the tea on that, and it was kind of everything was sort of sliding down the thing, very strange. And the whole time we were there was this parrot that sat on Peter's shoulder, sort of nibbling his collar. It was kind of a somewhat surreal moment. Anyhow, she was an reasonably old lady. Anyhow, she said she'd love to do it, but she couldn't do anything from scratch in a month, which is what we needed, you know. So we said, well, can you modify the picture that you've got, you know, which is what she did. She just took the picture she'd had and she added a lawnmower to it so that it fitted with the lyrics to I Know What I Like, and put these people behind the things, and it worked really well. And I mean, in many ways, it's the best piece of art we've ever had on the front cover. Whether it's the best cover, I don't know, but it's the best piece of art on a cover. This album, I think we came together much more as players. I think it's the first, you know, we sound convincing as players to a greater extent. In some ways, it was the most of the early albums. I suppose it's the most, you know, there's a bit more technique in there and stuff. I always like to think the technique is just another sort of paintbrush in a way. It's something you can use, and it can be very effective at times. You should never take over. I think with some groups it sort of it takes over. It becomes the technique's the thing. You know, you get a guitarist who can play so fast that you can't stop doing it and everything. And we're very happy to sort of sit down. I'm just very happy to just sit down and hold down chords, which I do a lot of the time. You know, I think that's, and then other times you'd go mad, and that sort of. The contrast works, and you just use it, and it illustrates something you want to try and illustrate with the piece of music you're writing, and I think that's interesting. And as you said before, I think Steve's playing on this was really good. Particularly, obviously, the fifth solo was a sort of standout moment, I think, for his time with us. Concept and lyric were all Peter's, and I'm not. I mean, I have to be honest, and I say that I think the actual story is the weakest thing about the album. I mean, I don't think the story is really very gripping. Some of the individual lyrics are wonderful, I think. But the totality just doesn't move me. It doesn't do anything for me, really. It reads a bit like a sort of Kurt Vonnegut novel or something, you know, without perhaps quite as good imagery. And I just that's always stays with me, really. It doesn't satisfy me in the way that some of the other albums do. I mean, the Supper's Ready concept was a much simpler thing, you know, good and evil, you know, but that worked great, I think. But this one, not so well. I think when we started writing, and we seemed to have quite a lot of ideas on the Lamb, we thought it would be the idea of making it a double album concept would be adventurous and would be quite a nice thing to try and do, you know. We had no idea what the concept was going to be or anything, but we felt that the audience our audience would be able to take it, you know. And so we found it quite an exciting idea of things to do. And then obviously we had to set about and think about what was the concept going to be about. And I think at this point, Peter sort of had an idea, and he seemed quite keen to do all the lyrics, which was something which we'd never done before. The lyrics have been very much split throughout the group prior to this time. And we weren't really in favour of this, you know. I mean, to be honest, I think the rest of us, because it felt that it would give the album a sort of one a one-dimensional quality. And I think lyrically, I mean, for me, it does have that for that reason. And but anyhow, I think perhaps the relationships in the group was getting a little bit more, wasn't quite as easy as it once had been. Probably because Peter was being thrust out as the star in a way. Media would only concentrate on Peter really, which was strange in a group that was as sort of as democratic as we were in a way, in the way everything came with music and everything was done. So that was a little bit difficult for us, I think. And obviously during the making of, while we were actually writing this album, Peter actually got an offer to do this film script for William Friedkin, and he decided he was going to do it and went off. And that was in the middle of the writing.
Looks at you once, we understand.
Coming back to it and doing the remixes and everything, what's actually on the tapes is really good, and to be honest, the original mix isn't bad either, I don't think, on this album. There's less change on this than, say, on the previous records, which was quite a bit of changing going on. I mean, you can still do a lot with it, a lot of moments you can really have fun with. And, things like with the 5.1, you can sort of, the different characters, like on Slipper Man, sort of voices out the back and things, which is quite nice. There's disconcerting things like that happening. So we tried quite hard to make it a sort of interesting 5.1 mix as well as the new stereo. So it works pretty well.
Rock face moves to press my skin. White liquid turns sour within. Turn fast, turn sour.
In terms of songs, I always think of The Lamb Lies Down itself being the sort of last song that Peter and I kind of ever wrote together, because we'd written a lot in the early days together and things. And it was a pretty good song to end on, really. But the rest of the album, sort of, as I said, it was kind of, I don't know what it is, something about it. I think the lyrics, although they're good lyrics, but it means that no song really kind of stands out on its own. What could have been, say, some really pretty song like The Lamia, for example. I mean, if you start singing that out of context, it makes no sense at all. It's sort of about snakes and stuff. And so I slightly resent that aspect of it, I suppose. And the one we obviously, there's two songs we perform quite often out of context from there, which one is In the Cage, which sort of almost works, although the Brother John bit in the middle lyrically doesn't make much sense, but I think it's a really strong piece of music, so it all stands up. And then the other one's The Carpet Crawlers, which works because it's got a chorus that kind of could relate to anything. I mean, the verse lyrics are pretty strange if you listen to them, but they're some lovely imagery in there as well, so I think that works well out of context.
The carpet crawlers, he dare call us. We gotta get him to get out.
Well, Carpet Crawlers, it's difficult to know really. When we wrote it, we had a couple of moments in the story that Peter had some action, which we didn't have any music for. So we sort of were sitting in the room, and Mike and I just sort of started just doodling, and played this very simple chord sequence to develop this idea, just the thing. And so that we said, well, there you go, there's a basis. And then Pete wrote this thing on top of it. Worked really well. It's one of those things, very simple, and I think that's half its charm. Sometimes with Genesis it's a bit overworked and we sort of put too much into things, and something like this, which is almost a sort of bog standard sort of chord sequence in a way. Well, the chorus is a little bit different, but it just gave it somewhere to go. And I think I don't know why. What is it? It's got it. I think the sort of the fact the song slowly crescendos, and it kind of just sort of creeps into you like that. It's got a very strong chorus hook as well, I think. Which is why I think why audiences like it, I don't know really. It shines out a little bit from the album in terms of its sort of solidity and confidence, I think, because the other songs I say are all a bit more meandering, and you just think there's one very sort of bright spark in the middle of the album like this, which at the time we wrote it, we had no idea that it was going to be picked out like that. We played the album to people, and we thought that probably the single would, if there was going to be a single, it would be Counting Out Time, and everyone said no, Carpet Crawlers is the one, We released the single, of course, it wasn't a hit or anything, but we've tried again. We've tried it a couple of times since then, releasing it. It's still never done anything.
Counting out time, got the whole thing down by numbers. All those numbers give me guidance.
Well, I think Counting Out Time is played because it's a pop song, in the way that some of the others ones are. It's that was a song of Pete's, actually, Counting Out Time, entirely. which I think is a good little song. I think it works very nicely. I think it's good in context of the album again because it's simpler compared with a lot of the other things. It's all about early sexual experiences, trying to do it by the book. That started off as a riff of Mike's. He just had this idea of playing on. He had a 6-string bass and he was playing this riff on it, and then we sort of developed that as a song, and then Pete just did this sort of shouting type vocal on it, which was kind of, at the time, was sort of quite surprising, but I think it works pretty well. Again, I think the song is a bit more complicated than it needs to be. I think there's a couple of little extra bits in the middle there that should probably, courtesy of me, in fact, I think, which probably be better off if they weren't there, but they are there, so that's what you've got. It's a funny album, this really, because I suppose it's sort of looked back on as something of a classic. I didn't really enjoy sort of writing or making this album to the same extent as I did all the other albums. I mean, there's a lot of my stuff on this album, I have to say, a lot of bits I had. Some bits I had around for a while, and, particularly with the bits that ended up in, obviously, The Lamb and The Cage and, and Lamy and Slipperman and all that sort of stuff. And we did a lot of improvising as well and created these bits. And I think some of the most exciting bits on the album are actually these little interludes that we had. One of my favourite ones is the one we ended up calling a Fly on a Windshield, I think, which was originally was called Pharaohs. And we just sort of sat down and was playing sort of fifths and just making it sort of like the Egyptian army sort of coming across the landscape was the idea, And we had a sort of quiet one and a loud one, and we just sort of butt joined them. But then with the lyric, the idea of this sort of fly hitting a windshield, and of course it comes in with such a big bang, which is probably the single best moment in Genesis. I think that's just that moment when it comes in, that first chord. After that, it's just downhill, but it's just a wonderful moment, I think.
And I'm hovering like a fly, waiting for the windshield on the freeway.
I think it works pretty well. Obviously, it's the idea was it's showing sort of images from the story and everything, and it has that kind of it has a sort of graphic novel sort of quality about it, which I quite like. Because I'm a bit of a graphic novel fan, and so I quite like the sort of dark thing about it. I think it was, it was a question of how we used it, whether we used it sort of bigger and over the whole album, or whether we just used that sort of band of stuff. And I think it works pretty well. I mean, it's in a lot of character, and also the writing, that sort of Greek lettering we used, which we've obviously come back to a few times later in our career, I think looks very strong on it, really. I think it was good because it gave whereas all the previous albums have all been a bit more romantic, this was a lot less romantic, this album, and having a stark black and white cover like that, I think it made you aware that this wasn't going to be quite as sort of cuddly, perhaps, as some of the previous stuff. As I said many times, when Peter and I started off in the group as sort of, kind of very best friends, I suppose, really. And obviously by then it was getting a little more difficult, I think, particularly within the group. So yes, it was a sort of sad time in that way, and you sort of felt that, particularly once when we did the tour, we did about 100 shows of The Lamb, which wasn't a fantastic show, to be honest, I don't think, although we tried very hard and had lots of good effects. It was trying to do the whole album, to an audience who really wanted to hear a lot of the old hits, made it a little more difficult. I think it's quite a difficult album. It's very dark and quite dense, but I think therefore people sort of, I think people if you try it and it still works really well. I think and I think it's rewarding, and perhaps it takes a little bit more to get into it in the first place, and maybe for that reason people, once they've got there, hold it up like that. But I think, in honesty, that's the thing about Genesis. Is a strange thing. We don't have any one album that everyone's going to say this is the one. Pink Floyd have got Dark Side of the Moon, whatever. With us, you'll get people saying any album. I've had every album said this is the one, part possibly from Genesis Revelation. I think it's just how you hear things. Sometimes it's at what point in your life you hear a thing, and you're a teenager or something hits you harder when you're sort of 15 than it does perhaps when you're sort of 25, and so it stays with you for that reason. I think we had a great deal of fear about how people would see us without Peter. I think we were very confident we could write material that was strong enough. And the problem was obviously, first of all, finding a singer, and then even if we found a singer, how people would respond to that new singer. Well, I think initially what happened was that, we sort of thought at a certain point that Phil could probably sing some of the songs. He'd done obviously done things like More Fool Me and done a lot of backup singing to Pete on various songs prior. So we felt we knew he had a lovely soft voice. So we thought things like Ripples and Madman Moon, things like that would be great for his voice. But we really weren't sure that he was. We never even contemplated that he'd be any right for Squonk or Volcano. These things that required a bit more power. And yes, we did get. We'd obviously recorded the song. And we did get this singer that we liked, and he came in and sang on it. I think the fact that we've got Bill Bruford at that point, was an important addition for us. So a drummer that Phil understood, that knew and liked, and felt could do the job. So the kind of whole package sort of happened all in one go like that, really. It was just a lot of luck involved in it. That we had a singer who was good enough in the band to take over from Peter, and for that reason, that I think the fans had no trouble, considering Phil as the man.
On your left and on your right, crosses are green, the crosses are blue. Your friends didn't make it through a crack in Mother Earth, blazing hot, the molten rock spills out over the land.
Dance to Volcano was the most started off for day one when Mike, Phil and I were there, because Steve in fact was finishing off his solo album, and we came in the studio and we just started improvising, and what became the first part of Dance to Volcano came out of that. And I was at that moment, I felt, having come in with a little bit of trepidation, thinking, well, what's going to happen, how's it going to be without Pete and all that. We wrote that and I thought, this is great, I'm really excited by this, and I think it set us off in a really good direction. I came in perhaps with the most complete songs. Mike came in with sections, and as did Steve, and as it happened, the bits we used to sort of finish them off were my bits. So I ended up being credited on every track on this album, which was sort of like quite funny. But on a song like, for example, Entangled, which was Steve had come in with this really nice sort of guitar bit, and it happened to be in 3/4, and I had this chorus that was sort of hanging around. I hadn't got any home for it, which was in 3/4 as well. So we tried the two together, and it worked really well. And it kind of, what Steve had written really didn't have a chorus. It needed something to kind of lead you to it. So the sort of, if we can help you, we will, that bit. I had this sort of split. I'd written on a piano, in fact, and I'd transferred it to guitar, and with the voice then singing what the piano used to play, which is kind of like the way the chords changed, produced quite a nice whole harmony piece, I think. And it makes for, I think Entangle's one of my favourite songs on the album. I think it makes for a very strong combination with a lyric written by Steve, which I think works really well as well.
If we can help you, we will.
It's a funny thing, really, because when at the time we did it, I mean, things like Volcano and Squonk and everything were ones I really liked, but coming back to it, the ones I actually prefer all the soft songs, I think. Madman Moon has always been a big favourite of mine, I suppose, but it was a song I wrote on my own completely. And, I was very pleased with some of the things. I mean, the middle is not played as well as it should be, But the verse parts and everything, it's just nice. The chord sequences, the chord changes and things, I was very pleased with them at the time, because they're sort of like, they're unusual, but then don't necessarily sound too unusual. And I think that's a good thing about a song. I don't want it to sound weird. I just want it to sort of be kind of, and it's very romantic, I suppose. And I think that works very well. Let me think what else. Well, Los Endos, I think it works very well. I mean, it certainly turned into a great live piece. It was great fun to play, and I felt it really rounded off the album well. Album covers can give a very strong identity to an album, I think, and Trick or Tale is one where that's the case, really. And you get this idea of a sort of storybook sort of feel out of it, and the songs are quite distinct and a lot of the songs do have a kind of story to them, and I think that makes it very strong. Slightly sort of Dickensian kind of look, I think, which worked just so nicely on the brown on the sort of on that kind of parchment-like paper. When it came out, I think it was a funny thing. There was a certain element of the public who really were quite glad to not have Pete there, because he sort of made it kind of seems so strange, in some ways. But I mean, part of that I really liked. But anyhow, there was a kind of some people who had had a bit of trouble with Pete. There was a time to reassess, put it like that. And we're also lucky that at that particular period in time you didn't need a hit single, because obviously there's no hit single on this album. And I think a lot of the existing fans really liked it, and then we've got some new fans, and it just seemed to sort of take off, I suppose, really. I mean, I think the previous album having been a double album as well meant that this album had a chance, it was a bit easier for people to take in. And as you say, it starts very strong with Volcano. I think people put it on and think, yeah, that sounds fantastic. And then, with songs like sort of obviously like Entangled and Ripples, which have got very strong choruses, I think it works on a lot of levels. There's quite a lot of music written beforehand on this album, and I think when we finished the album, the only thing that worried me a little bit was perhaps the album was more, particularly when we left off the 3 tracks we did, which were all kind of quite simple tracks, that the album was really quite a heavy album, quite a difficult album. But I mean, I liked that. You see, I always thought I like an album to be a challenge, and it wasn't an album that was going to be liked first time. Apart from possibly Your Own Special Way, virtually every other track requires quite a bit of listening, I think, to get into. And but at that time, I think, we were able. I think we had people who were prepared to give us the time. Some people, I remember the reviews of the album were a bit like, oh, disappointing after Trick of the Tail type thing. But I think for the fans, it's a better album. I think it's a romantic album. That's probably why I like it as much as I do. I'm sort of, perhaps that era of music excites me more in a way. The chords are much more sort of expansive, if you like, and the way they change is sort of more yearning. It's not. This is about as far away as you can get from sort of straight ahead 3-chord rock, and I like a bit of that myself, but this album's as far away from it.
They get me confused, boy, puts me off to sleep, and the thing I hate, oh Lord.
It's kind of been growing in confidence, I think, over the years with Genesis. I mean, you must appreciate that when we started off that both Phil and Steve were very much junior members, particularly in relation to the composition, and I think at this stage, whereas Mike and I had sort of perhaps been dominant, certainly on Trick of the Tail, and we probably were on Wind and Wuthering as well, I think. But he definitely had more moments when he came to the fore. And this was particularly true, I think, on Blood on the Rooftops, which I think is a lovely track. It's one of my favourite tracks we did.
Blood on the rooftops, Venice in the spring. Follow me, I give you strength inside you, courage to.
The 3 main songs I wrote on this, I wrote totally on my own, which was obviously The One for the Vine, Afterglow, and All on a Mouse's Night. When I played One for the Vine to the guys, it was kind of like I just played the whole thing through with me sort of warbling on top, and I don't know what they thought at the end of that. But I think they thought if we don't do it, he'll get so irritable, start throwing things, that we'll have to have a go at it, So we just put it down in the studio. I just put the whole thing down with the piano and drums, really, and then we sort of overdubbed everything else on top of it. And it was just faith, really, in the end, that they sort of stuck with me, I think, because I think it turned out good, actually, and I think the contribution from all the others is really good as well. So it's I was quite pleased with that. But I mean, because that song had really taken me, since Trick of the Tail, I'd sort of been working on that and honing it and trying to get it right. Whereas the song Afterglow, which was the final song, I really wrote just about in the time it took to play it. I just sort of sat down and thought, I just fancied using that chord sequence, and then started singing on it. And I was really excited by that, because I thought, I don't normally do things like that. And then about a couple of days after I'd written, I suddenly thought, shit, what I've done is I've written Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas again. It was a terrible thought, and I was thinking, Have Yourself, and I listened to that particular song and realised it wasn't the same. I could get away with it, but it's a terrible moment when you think, God, I'll never get away with it. But so I mean, I think Afterglow, which obviously then became a big stage favourite, it was just a very strong kind of, sort of anthemic kind of piece, which I think closed the album really well. So I think, I was very pleased with that. For me, it's one of my 2 favourite Genesis albums. I think it's got so many good moments on it. So that's the way I feel about it. But I think it's the most extreme of a certain kind of album. It's the most extreme in terms of the kind of the harmonic area, and probably the most complex in musical terms of all the albums we did, I think. perhaps he thought it was time to try and go solo and see it and play his chances. I always felt that I never felt that Steve necessarily saw himself ever as being totally integrated into the band, that at some point he would probably leave. So I wasn't that surprised, but I was surprised when he left, I have to say, because it was in the middle of the mixing of the live album, Seconds Out. And, as I said, I was sorry to see him go. I really would have been very happy for him to have been on after that. Losing Steve, I think, slightly lost an ally in going and doing things a little bit weird sometimes. He would like to do weird things, and I like to do weird things, and we could sort of sometimes drag it that way for a bit longer. When it was just down to me, it was a bit different. But I think then there were three also. We were kind of felt we'd done the idea of trying to keep the songs a little more concise to get more ideas on the album was quite appealing. Something we'd sort of wanted to do, regardless. And even with one or two of the songs I wrote on this, because I wrote the song, say, Burning Rope on this album, which is kind of like, it looked like when I was writing it was going to be like One for the Vine. And in fact, there was the other sections that were in the song. And then I decided to kind of abbreviate it and not make it quite such a long thing. A, because I didn't want comparisons to that, and B, I thought, well, I've done that, I think I'll just leave it for this album and not do that. And then, so we could get more different ideas. But the other thing about this album was, I think this was the point when Phil was probably most distant from the group in many ways.
The words of love, the cries of hate.
Much as I liked playing with Steve and everything, I don't think we really thought twice about this one. We felt we knew we could do this, having been through it with Pete. But also, I think what perhaps a lot of people hadn't realised up to that point was just how much of the rhythm guitar was all Mike. He's a rhythm guitarist, so the lead guitar and everything that came with that was Steve. But the rhythm guitar, which had been so prevalent in things like sort of Cinema Show or Musical Box or anything right the way through the whole career of Genesis, had been Mike, and so we knew he could do that. The only thing was whether he could cope with lead, and and he had to definitely had to work a bit at that to get sort of the right mindset for lead guitar. But on this album, there's two or three. There's not much lead guitar, but what there is, he plays well, I think. But he had to think about it quite hard.
I thought I was lucky. I thought that I'd got it. How could I be so blind?
Probably have a slight problem here because the two other tracks that I would really pick out are both ones that I wrote, which were Undertow, which I was kind of pleased. It's sort of slightly different way for me to write, really, where there's sort of slightly less chord dependent and a bit more dependent. The melody and the piano part is very much sort of got the melody and the chords all enveloped in it, and I think it's and it was the first time I'd used the Yamaha CP70 electric piano on a record, and with the chorus sound and everything, it gives it quite a distinctive effect. And then Mike was playing fretless bass on it. I think that turned out really well. To me, that's probably my favourite track on the album. And the other one that I like a lot is Many Too Many, which again is a love song, which again I wrote the lyrics, so I was obviously coming out of my shell here. It's still a bit weird, it's not totally straightforward, but it's all I remember about Many Too Many was at the time we were doing it, that trying to say to Phil, yes, you can sing Mama, it's all right, you can sing Mama, which is the chorus is, oh Mama, does it help me find the way and everything. And I said, Stevie Wonder uses Mama in his lyrics all the time, so you can do it. Because he was so against, he felt very self-conscious about doing it. Of course, about a couple of years later, there was a song which we did, obviously called Mama, where it's the main lyric all throughout the song. But at the time, it's sort of, perhaps he felt a bit self-consciously trying to be, what we weren't. But I think it sounds good. I know no one ever felt at the time that it didn't work from that point of view. When we were recording it, the guy who was our engineer producer at the time, Dave Henschel, didn't rate it at all, and so he was a bit dismissive about it. And so we did a mix of it, which wasn't terribly good, I don't think. And then we played it to the record company, and they said, that's a hit, you've got to do. So we went back and remixed it and got it a bit better. So we thought it was a hit. I mean, I felt it was the first time I thought we'd ever written a hit. We were very lucky that Follow You, Follow Me was a hit, because it meant that we suddenly, we were kind of suddenly on radio, so that people couldn't ignore us, really. You must remember this came out in the middle of sort of, I don't know, was it just after punk? I don't know. it was kind of a strange thing. We were sort of still surviving. Couldn't quite work out why, because everyone else seemed to have gone. ELP had died, Yes had died, and everything like this, and we were still going along. And we were lucky to have perhaps this hit single, which sort of came out suddenly in the middle of all this, and we were okay. I think we came in there with the intention of trying to sort of, a little bit barren of ideas, so we sat down and did a lot more improvising. And some of the ideas I had that I hadn't really developed, I had this riff, which was the opening part of Behind the Lines, which was doing, which was just almost just a rotating sort of riff, four keys. And I hadn't really developed it, so we sat down and started playing it, and then immediately sort of started developing little ideas came and things, and then in fact the whole song which came from it was actually just a development of that first part, but it wasn't something written beforehand at all. So that it very much emerged in the studio from that one idea, and that's how a lot of the things happened on this a bit. Something like Duchess would really developed, I think, more than anything out of the drum machine. That first time we ever used one was really exciting, because the whole thing was it would kind of carry on without you having to do anything. That was what was nice about it, so you could try something and then if it didn't work, whereas a drummer always wants to do something fiddly. A drum machine just keeps on relentlessly doing the same thing. So I'd used it as an aid to when I was writing on my first solo album, A Curious Feeling. I'd used the drum machine very much as a sort of basis to sort of write against, but I didn't end up using any of it specifically on the album, which I slightly regret now. Whereas on this, we did on that one track, and it gave it a very distinctive feel. And then Duchess, and I think, Duchess is probably one of my favourite tracks we've ever done. Very simple, a lyric that sort of is very easy to relate to in the sense of, the rise and fall of a female rock star, really, which we call Duchess. We could have called it Madonna if we'd sort of thought about it, but because Madonna hadn't been created by that point, but it would have been more interesting, wouldn't it?
But now every time that she
for me, this is the first album where he really sounds like a singer. I have to be honest about that. I did some lovely singing on the previous albums, but it's not as convincing as it is on this album, I think. I just think some of the singing on it is really good, not just on the songs he wrote, but things like, Duchess, I think the singing on that is really tremendous. I just think it's sort of, he also knew what to do a bit. When I wrote because I wrote the lyric and the melody to Duchess on what we'd done as an improvisation, and I did a version of it, and I sang it, made a tape of it, and played it and things, and it's all the elements are there, but when he sang it, it's not just that he's got a better voice than me, it was the fact that all the little kind of embellishments and tales and things that happened on it just transformed it completely from being something like a sort of session guy might do to something that a singer does, and his own character is sort of right across it for that reason, and the resultant effect is very, very strong. As a writer, he was contributing more to the band now than he had done in the past. I'd still say that this album is still more dominated by what Mike and I wrote, but that Phil was coming up much more to be a kind of equal kind of writer, which I think is a strength, I think, because we had the variety which each of us gave, he had a directness. If Phil's I'm the least direct, and Mike's and Phil's the most direct, and then Mike's somewhere in the middle, and the combination could work quite well. We'd pull each other in different directions. I'd make him expand a bit, and then he'd make me contract, which was not a bad thing to do. Otherwise, every song would be 25 minutes long. Yes, they would have gone Behind the Lines, Duchess, guide vocal, Turn It On Again, Duke's Travels, Duke's End, which is actually how we performed it when we were live. We tried it. The reason we didn't do it, one reason we didn't do it is we didn't want the comparisons with Supper's Ready, and felt maybe it wasn't the moment to do a sort of a totally combined thing like that. As it is, there is quite a lot of linkage between those tracks anyhow. The first three are linked. And at the time when we were talking about this, the bit that became Turn It On Again was just a link. It was just, we went once around the whole sequence, just the two bits, and then went on into Duke's Travels, and we did it and we recorded all this stuff, and I thought that's much too strong to just do once, so we did it twice.
all I need is a TV show there on the radio.
My bit was slow too, in fact. We were playing the whole it was more like that. And then Phil sort of, he was kind of in a certain kind of mood in those days, and it's the drums are what make it. Absolutely, the drums are what make it, which is a sort of key thing. That's why it's so much a group song, even though musically it came from the two of us. But It's and it just gave it an energy and something that we hadn't seen in it at all originally. It was a hit single, and of course it's a slightly. I think often wonder whether "Turn On Again" would have been even played on the radio if we hadn't had "Follow You, Follow Me," because it's a more complex piece of music. I mean, it's deceptively simple because it has an extra beat every sort of third bar or whatever it is, and I think it goes through a lot of chords and things. And as you say, the chorus, there is no sort of particular chorus line until the end of the song, so you kind of you wonder whether it would have been. In fact, when we played this to the record company, this album to the record company, they said, "Oh, there's a great hit on there." We said, "Yeah, we know. It's Turn On Again." They said, "Oh, no, it's Alone Tonight." We said, "Alone Tonight," Oh, God, no. And we said, "No, it's got to be Turn On Again." So we went with that. Well, I think for one reason or another, we weren't very happy with the and then there were 3 cover. We just felt it was sort of like didn't really do much. It was a bit nebulous and everything, and we were a bit stuck for ideas. And I don't think Hypnosis came up with their best idea for that, really. I mean, it sort of has a character to it because you kind of related to the album now, really. But thinking that the album was probably kind of fairly a bit more straightforward and quite fresh. It's got a very gloomy, dark cover. I think you could have had something a little bit more kind of up. But that's our fault as much as anything else. I think with Duke, we just thought, well, we want something different, so we went to look at a different area for a designer, and he actually came down with various suggestions of possibilities. And one thing he came down with was this ABC done by this French guy, which had this character on it. And we looked through this, and we thought we really like this style. It's great. And we looked through the book, and we got to Q, and had this what is actually the album cover, which had a Q, a question mark above it, because it was just a simple alphabet book. We took the question mark out and used it really. This album, I have to be honest, this is my favourite Genesis album, really. It has such a sort of positive quality about it. I love the way it starts. When I say I love Duchess, it works fantastically, and I love all the instrumental stuff towards the end too. I think, although it starts a little weak, but it just gets really good, and there's a strong emotional moment when it gets to the repeat of guide vocal done within Duke's Travels, which is a very intense piece of sort of singing and everything, and I think that's to me is one of the strongest. This is one of those very strong moments in Genesis music. It just sort of felt quite good. And then when we were thinking about titling the album and the song, really, particularly the album, we wanted to get across this more abstract nature of it. We felt this was the most unromantic thing we'd done, whereas in Wind and Wuthering was only 3 albums before, it'd been so romantic. This was much less romantic. A lot of the album's tracks were very stark and much more kind of, had a much more straightforward approach, I suppose. And we wanted to get that across with the cover, so we went with a totally abstract design on the cover, but it's not definable. It just looks, it's just got nice sort of shapes and colours, and gave the title, which Abacab, which means nothing at all really, as a title. So the thing was like an abstract painting, is why I saw it really, and that was the final effect. So you didn't really get any particular kind of thing off the album at all. Before you heard it, it was kind of, you just knew that it wasn't going to be. Goblins and fairies. That's about what you knew it wasn't going to be that. So, and that's right, it wasn't. It was a definite, very conscious decision here to try and break with some of the Genesis traditions. Really, get rid of the reprises, the extended solos, the big choruses and tambourines and everything. Just to have something a different approach. And because Phil had this experience of working on Peter's album, particularly, but of this drum sound effect. And then we used the engineer Hugh Padgham, who'd worked on that album, and a lot of the size of the tracks are created by the drums rather than by keyboards. We'd always done it with keyboards. The big keyboard pad came in on the chorus and stuff. It was wide and everything. But the drums themselves, just by bringing up the ambient sound of the kit, just gave it such a big size. Very exciting effect, I think. I really liked it, and it meant you could write in a slightly different way and have a different approach. So the drums are very prominent on this album, I think, and they're a very, very big feature of it. For many people, it's kind of, the worst track we ever did. Because I really like it, but perhaps I'm just perverse. I had this thing of abusing a Prophet 5, and I'd sit there and I'm doing this all the time, and Mike and Phil were just sort of, the only way we're going to shut him up is if we record this. So we recorded it, and Phil put on this very, very simple, very slappy sort of drum on it. And then he wrote a lyric for it, which was like, which kind of was as irritating as the song itself. You mention it around here sometimes, sort of, some of the roadies and things, not too done it. But anyhow, I think that was quite good. And when we played it to the Americans, the album, because we had 2 or 3 other songs we could have put on it, and there was a possibility of not using Who Done It. And I remember Armit Erdogan saying, you've got to put that track on. Because I think it's just because it had such a character to it. Because we had a very, very nice romantic song called You Might Recall, which was recorded at this time, which, was a strong contender for the album. But in the end, we decided to go for the ugly rather than the beautiful. We wanted to try to keep that kind of the inhuman aspect of it. I think is what we liked about it. It becomes something inhuman and relentless. And when a thing repeats absolutely like that, it becomes almost subliminal. So you're paying too much attention to it. And then Mike he was playing this riff, which kind of like goes very much against the rhythms as the two things are kind of quite strangely positioned. If you hear it, sometimes you hear it, God, it's all out of time. And then the chorus comes in and all the chords are sort of anticipated and things, and the resultant effect is kind of strange. That it's all doing this a bit. But I think the resultant song, I think it works really well. I mean, it's just a lovely sort of, got very stark verses and very romantic choruses. And I kind of wrote a lyric that kind of did that. So the idea was that this character had to pretend that he'd been robbed by people, and that's why he disappeared for a few weeks. And in fact, what had happened to him, he'd been taken up in a spaceship and gone to this fantastic world where everything was wonderful and beautiful and everything. But he couldn't tell anybody that because no one would believe him. So I thought it was quite a nice idea. It is simplified, there's less kind of extraneous stuff in there, certainly. And I think, the tracks that, things like Abacab and obviously Keep It Dark, which is one of my favourite tracks on this album, it's very simple. And it's just one riff. And it was actually just a drum loop. It wasn't even drummed all the way through, just had a drum riff going all the way through it. And I just think it produced it has a very distinctive quality about it. I think what it did for us was it took us, having gone in a certain direction a certain way, we then went quite a long way a different direction. And then perhaps after that we kind of brought a bit of that, came back a bit, but brought a bit of that in with us from then on. And I think it was an important move, really. So this album, in fact, was the last album we credit anything to individuals. And we each put one track of our own on there. And everything else was group written. And it was very much group written. It was the way it emerged out of just jamming and improvising, and these ideas would evolve. I think we felt with Abacab, we sort of like, in many ways, you cleared out all the furniture, And so with Genesis, it was a kind of a question of redecorating a little bit. And I think, we had some areas we hadn't been in before. We had our own studio at this point in time, which obviously we had for Abacab, but it was the first time we were able to actually record in the studio. It's always referred to now as the Mummer album, at least we always referred to it as the Mummer album, so perhaps we should have just called it that. But at the time it didn't seem that obvious, and we thought, well, we've never called an album Genesis, let's just call this one that. We had various versions of it. We had the drum machine part, and then I'd sort of bass pedal and put all these sounds on top of it, and we had a sort of atmosphere going which we knew was going to be strong. We didn't know quite what the top line was going to be. It could have been a lot of things and still been good. So we sort of got a basis down very early and worked on it like that. Portable amplifier was just jumping over the ground like this, but it produced this fantastic sound. It made the drum machine sound really, really good. And almost just from hearing that thing doing that, we felt we got a song. With the lyrics on songs, you're always looking for something. I think Phil himself had got quite into the stage of where it was more important how the lyrics sounded almost than what it meant in some cases. And I think Mama's an example of that, really. It's sort of loosely probably about sort of prostitute or something, really, but you don't quite know what she is, but you've got this sort of feel about it, like Rocky Raccoon, I always think about, which was always a song I liked a lot by the Beatles, and great feel, really. I mean, I started playing that piano riff, and then Phil started doing this riff, and we knew we had a feel, quite know where it was going, and I just purposely kept all the chords very simple, and just sort of had you didn't want to kind of go miles in any direction. I wanted to kind of stay where it was because it felt really good.
But why does it always seem to
Home by the Sea, where we were able to improvise. Phil had this is the riff, the dum chicka jung jung, that, which was the second part, and Mike and I just improvised on top of it, and we made up a couple of 30-minute tapes of us just improvising on top of it, and then went through it and just found the good bits and stuck them all together, and that's exactly what you've got on the piece, and I think it's one of my favourite of our instrumental pieces of all.
Creeping up the blind side, shining up the wall, stealing through the dark of night.
When we were writing the song, Phil had this one phrase he kept singing, "Home by the sea, home by the sea," and I thought, well, I know I was writing the lyrics to this thing. I thought, well, home by the sea, what does that conjure up? I thought, well, let's have a spooky home by the sea, you know, and the idea of a burglar going in there and actually getting enveloped and suddenly being all these ghosts surrounding him, everything just quite appealed to me. And also some of the melodic, some of the little keyboard things that were happening sort of felt a bit ghosty. And I thought that was quite a nice thing to do. And then the idea really, which the song is of the idea that we're telling our life story through our songs, which is sort of represented by the third verse of the song, as we relive our lives in what we tell you, which I think is quite a sort of strong thing. And it's sort of what you do in a group, I think.
As we relive our lives in what we tell you.
Instrumental music is a very important ingredient in Genesis music. I think it's something that makes us distinctive, you know. It's for those that know our records well, it's always a lot of standout moments that have been that way. I think, you know, you go back to the days of Cinema Show or Firth the Fifth, they're sort of probably on that particular album set in England, those are probably almost the most memorable pieces of music, you know. And I think on this, you know, Home by the Sea, that second Home by the Sea thing is a very strong melodic piece, and it works very well instrumentally. It's very exciting, so yes, they are important.
Beyond the silver rainbow.
Side one, as it were, the old side one, it's kind of got the three best known songs on it. And Mama That's All and Home by the Sea. And the second side is slightly more quirky songs on it. It's a slightly forgotten side, I think, in many ways, of Genesis. And I think it contains a couple of, you know, of classic songs. One of them, The Silver Rainbow, which I think is a real favourite of mine. You know, it was Phil started playing this kind of sort of like Adam and the Ants kind of drum thing, you know, with the Simmons and just banging his way through it, and started playing this piano riff on top of it, and I thought it was a really strong song, and I hoped it would go a little further than it did, actually, but it wasn't sort of recognised. Inspiration was very lacking, I think, on this thing. I don't know, we used the guy, Bill Smith, who'd done the previous Abacab album, which we thought was a great cover, really liked that a lot. And this one, we were a bit stuck for ideas, and he'd got this photo, and we looked at it, we thought it was quite interesting, you know, but then we actually put it on the album, we thought, we don't think this is very good. And we almost tried to do a last-minute sort of change of the cover. But, I mean, in the end, it is just a cover, I suppose, but it's not a classic one. The idea seemed better than the result, let me put it like that. Having done all these remixes, I've had a chance to sort of look at everything, and you know, you come across bits and pieces that you'd sort of forgotten about a little bit, really, and songs you'd sort of, you know, a bit secondary in your own brain, you know. Things like It's Gonna Get Better on the second side of this album. Again, it's another one I've sort of forgotten about a bit, but and it sounded really good. I think on this album, and that's quite a good representation on this, was one thing that occurred in sort of keyboard land between Abacab and this album was the introduction of sampling synthesizer, and some of the sounds, you know, on the album. I mean, things like the koto that's used in the middle of Mama, and various other little bits and pieces. But what I used to like to do was, which obviously is done a lot nowadays, was sample like little bits of music and then see what you could do with it. And an example of that is on the introduction to It's Gonna Get Better, where I just recorded the beginning of this classical album. It just was four cello notes. And I'd originally recorded it to try and get a good string sample, you know, and I pressed it, it sounded awful. But then for some reason I pressed four notes at the same time, and this incredible interweaving harmonies all suddenly came up. I thought, this is brilliant, you know, fantastic. I'm doing nothing and it's sounding wonderful. And so that sort of, you know, made me think, and I just became quite a big feature within Genesis from then on, really, using those kind of ideas. I think going into Invisible Touch, we did feel quite self-confident, you know, we felt we'd sort of really kind of broken ground, particularly live and everything, and suddenly we'd started to play big places, and you know, university around the world, probably finally reached a certain platform in America that we sort of hadn't quite made before, I don't felt. I don't know, we went in there with a lot of confidence. We seemed to have an incredible number of ideas, just improvised all the time, and endless songs kept falling out, you know. It was a really enjoyable album to make, you know. I felt that we just managed to, I think there's a sort of confidence, a confidence allows you to write shorter pieces, in a way. In a strange way, for a certain someone like me, it's very much easier to write great long pieces, through all this wonderful stuff, and funny chord changes and everything, and you almost don't have to sort of answer the question, well, is that bit good enough for it to be there? You just sort of do it and it happens. Whereas on these things, if you've only got 3.5 minutes, 4 minutes of the song, and you think you want it to be a good song, every bit's got to count, every aspect of it. And I think we got, you know, we did some good job on this. It certainly took us to a different kind of level, and I always thought at the time, and I remember we were doing this because we did Invisible Touch, the album came out, and it was #1 and everything, and then we came about a year later, we did the Wembley Stadium, four nights at Wembley Stadium, and the album went back up, actually got #2 I think again, and it had been in the top 10 I think the whole year. It was just extraordinary really, and you know, I did think when we did those shows at Wembley Stadium, I thought it will never be bigger than this. This is it, you know, we've had an album that's been #1 everywhere, and you know, we're selling out this shows 4 times and everything. And it was a great feeling. I just thought it was, you know, I'll enjoy it, I think, because I thought it might not last. It lasted longer than I thought it was going to, actually. Obviously, we edited it down as a single, and it was a big hit in the States, particularly, and it was a hit in England, I think, too, actually. But it's obviously, it's, you know, the extended version has quite a long middle 8. It's more like a traditional Genesis song, goes through lots of changes, and there's this sort of very ethereal kind of middle part, which, you know, is a very nice piece of music actually, but it's obviously didn't make it onto the single. But it's, you know, I guess I can't put my finger on what it is really. I mean, obviously Phil had got him, he'd become established more as a singles act. That opened a few doors for us in terms of radio, prepared to sort of, you know, listen to it, I suppose. But I think the songs were there anyhow, you know, something like Invisible Touch or Land of Confusion. They're hit songs, I think, by anybody. Well, to me, it is a very important track, Domino. I mean, you know, it's sort of, I suppose, I'm sure they will say it's kind of more me, perhaps, than the others in a way. The lyrics mine, and I was trying to get across sort of a political kind of message, and it's sort of, you know, about how politicians, a bit like what people are like nowadays, I think, in a way, but politicians don't sort of sometimes, I think through what it is they've started off. You know, they do something, and then the fact that all these people are going to be, you know, people's husbands are going to be killed, and all the unexpected consequences that occur when you start something off, you know. People tend to think very sort of blinkered about a thing. They think we've got to get rid of this guy, got to do that. And of course everything else happens. And that's what the song was all about, really. And it was a nice, big, long song. Gave you an opportunity to have a bit of fun, both lyrically and musically. And also it's the end section is very strong, the bit, you know, it's got a very strong guitar riff, and it's worked, you know, it's a classic stage song ever since, I think. It's one of the, in a funny way, it's almost, from a stage point of view, it's one of the best songs off the album, just because it gives you more room to breathe. You know, the longer songs tend to work better on stage, I think. Well, Land of Confusion was a lyric that Mike wrote. Yes, it was a sort of obviously, well, it's got a much more straightforward political message, I think, really, and being a more instant song and a more of a hit, it's probably had slightly more effect. And it was. The video obviously was great fun to do for that, you know. I mean, it's the best video we ever did, far and away, because we're not in it. It's as simple as that. There was lots of great moments in the video, I think. It was, and you know, just the little moment of the hands, I think, which happens in the middle of the video. These are the hands we're given, bit, which is just quite touching and just sort of. I think it was a good combination, really, and it produced. It actually won a Grammy, which is the only Grammy that Genesis have ever come anywhere near. So it was nice. In the rehearsal room, I'd often just switch on the machine, you know, the emulator, and just record whatever's happening in the room. And Mike was just playing along, and Phil was doing something, and I recorded it. And this thing was there, and I slowed it down or something, or we combined a couple of different notes to get an effect. Because what they play on their own wasn't very interesting, I promise you. Put it together, and it just produced this thing, and I looped it, and I thought, well, that sounds really interesting. And then Phil started playing along with it.
and it developed into a song that I think was into a piece, and the whole thing was quite quirky, so I just sort of, played a rather, one reviewer described it as the cheesiest synthesizer sound of all time, I think, and that was all sort of part of it for me. It was just kind of like a bit strange, and I quite like things like that. There were two, because there was another instrumental we did on this recording, which was Do the Neurotic, which is obviously on the extra CD for this lot. And the two, it was a question of which do we use. Do the Neurotic was a much more traditional Genesis piece, more like Los Endos, lots of things happening, and musically a very interesting thing. Or the Brazilian, which is a much more quirky piece. And in the end, the vote went for the Brazilian, which I think we all felt at the time was perhaps the right thing. I always like the idea of the invisible touch, although obviously in the thing it's all about a girl, But the invisible touch is also quite a nice way to describe music, And so you've got this hand at the front which is coming out to touch you. I thought that was quite an effective thing. The resultant effect I don't think is particularly beautiful, but it's quite distinctive, And you saw it in the shops. You was, oh yeah, they got it. Oh, it's there, So instantly recognisable. And again, it works pretty well in the CD format because it's just small and it kind of is distinctive. So it's one of those examples where it's a piece of graphic art without really being particularly beautiful. When we came into this business back in 1969 or something, we did Genesis Revelation. It was, we were with Jonathan King. We were trying to do hit singles. That's what we were trying to do. We just tried to write hits, and no one would do them, and we didn't appear to be that good at doing it. And then I think we were sort of shown the way by groups at the time, like the King Crimsons and Family and Fairport Convention, of another way of approaching music a little bit, and that's why we went to go into the progressive thing. And we found that we were kind of able to do things in that area that no one else was doing, whereas in the pop area, we weren't so original. By the time we got to this stage, I think we just felt we'd kind of almost gone as far as we could in certain directions of going into deep progressive music and extended solos and all the rest of it. And the idea of trying to craft songs a little bit more was quite appealing. So that's what ended up on this album. It was a good blend, I think. I think it's I was pretty excited when we finished this album. I thought this is really good, and I liked it because it was both. I still thought it was musically a very interesting album, and yet it was also obviously had a wide appeal. I think we were fairly confident with going into We Can't Dance. I was actually surprised to see that Phil was still there, actually. I fully expected him to have disappeared. He'd had so much success, I thought, he doesn't need us guys anymore. I felt pretty confident going in that we could do something good, I felt that, I still felt a lot of good ideas around. And we were writing, and we decided to change producer just to sort of, or producer-engineer, just to give ourselves a bit of a kick in the arse, really. I'd worked with Nick Davis, went to my solo album Still and things, and Mike had worked with them as well. And we thought it would be fun to try someone different. And of course, Nick has ended up being the man who's done all the remixes, he's a very, very good engineer, producer style guy. But so all those things were a little bit different. And we went in, and again, just the same way as we had with Invisible Touch, we had nothing written, and we just started improvising and seeing what ideas would come. And fortunately, things came. Sounds like an elephant being sick, which is a very distinctive sound. Again, I always like to try and get a sound in there if I can. This was, again, just sampling noise in the room, and it was just Mike actually making some thrashing around, and I just cut out this little bit in the middle of it, and then slowed it right down, and just used the front end of it, and stuck it with this E minor chord, and the effect was fantastic. I thought, this is great, I love this. And immediately, then Phil started warbling on top of it, and we thought we've got a song here that sounds really good. If you can just set up an atmosphere sometimes, that's what it's all about. You just get a sort of a feel going. And funnily enough, what you do after it sometimes is not so important. Once you've got that initial mood, it carries you for a long, long time. And so I was very proud of that one. And then I thought the lyric that Phil wrote on top of it, I thought was one of the best as well. Really good, that. It's probably my favourite song on the album in many ways. We play it on stage and everything. It still sends shivers down my spine. It's just a song. It seems if you can do it all with sort of like a few chords and simple rhythm, then I think there's nothing to be said against that.
It was on a divine visitation that the Lord told me that I was to go on the television. The Lord actually talks to me, you know. I hear what's being said. And he said to me, get me $18 million by the weekend. And the angel of the Lord stands by my side and speaks into my ear. It's a beautiful thing, and I hear what's being said. It's a marvelous, marvelous experience. I never thought such a thing could happen. In the name of Jesus.
When we first went to America back in the early 70s, you switched on the telly, and we all came down one day and said the same, did you see that on television? We just couldn't believe it. It was just unbelievable. I'd never, having been brought up on sort of Z cars and stuff, you suddenly see this guy sort of, I believe and all this. It was something extraordinary. We were mesmerised by it, really. The middle eight, which was great, because we could pretend to be like we felt the evangelists really were, and we've got the swimming pools, all these beautiful girls around us, so one chance to have beautiful girls everywhere, so we took it.
One for me practicing what I'm preaching. One for me making no sacrifice.
Couldn't quite find the way to do it. We tried doing it heavy, filled, sort of playing big drums and all this big nothing was really sounding very good. And one time I got this new keyboard, which was a sort of Roland thing, and it had a sort of preset drum sound thing on it. And I just started playing along with it. It had a bass drum, like boom, 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 like this, and then started playing these silly sounds on top of it. And the whole thing suddenly took on this completely different character. And we thought, well, this is really good. We'll do it like that. And what we did was actually after we'd written it, we didn't do anything to it for about the next month or two, and then just said, well, we'll put that song down, the one with the guitar. And the next day we had the song, and we thought, that's great. It's just so simple, just keep it really, really simple. A lot of humour, and it works. A great contrast to other things we've done in our career, really. So I was, pretty pleased with that as well.
But I can dance, I can talk. The only thing about me is the way that I walk.
As we get older and older, the only thing that people remember about us is this walk, But it's good to be remembered for something, is what I'd say, Driving the Last Spike was a slightly interesting thing for us in a way, because it had always been on previous albums, only the previous 3 or 4, the long songs. Tony writes the lyrics for the long songs and all the rest of it. And on this one, Phil said, well, let me have a go. I'd like to try a long song. So he said, okay. I said, well, let's Drive the Last Spike. Why not, And so he wrote a lyric, which I think was, from his point of view, he really enjoyed doing, because he could stretch a little bit more and write more of a story and bring in other ideas. This is what you can do on a long song. You've got, and also instrumental things kind of illustrate things. You've got the nice sort of mechanical bit in the middle of that where the sort of everything's going. And I think when you're writing a lyric like that, you listen to the song and the little ideas come at you from it. And so I think it has a different character from sort of things like Domino, Home by the Sea, where I tend to get slightly more intense, and he's got a slightly different approach. I think it works quite nicely.
Waving goodbye as I left them in tears, remembering all we'd said.
The We Can't Dance album cover I thought was a nice return to form. I thought it was the best album cover we'd had certainly since Duke. Again, kind of similar to Duke in a way. It's very simple, just a sort of a cartoon type picture almost, but strong atmosphere, I think, and just a feel about it that suggested that the album, had a little more romance in it perhaps than the previous one, and just, I think it worked nicely, and a great logo too, which of course we've ended up using ever since then. The E's the wrong way round, just seems to still fit. There were a lot of good moments on it, really, and we were very confident at this stage. And I did feel when we finished this record, probably the only time in my career I thought, well, I think this is going to do very well, this album. Every other time I've always had a bit of trepidation, but this time I felt pretty good. My inclination was, let's call it a day, or let's see, who knows in 10 years' time, like now, in fact. He might sort of say, why not have a go again? But, we talked about it, and Mike particularly was quite keen. He said, well, let's just go in the studio, see what happens, Right, improvise, see what happens. So of course we went to the studio, started improvising, oh, this sounds really good, I like this bit and stuff. But it was just the two of us, and we needed to get a singer. So that was the problem, really, trying to find a singer. Obviously we looked for a singer, and we ended up auditioning 2 people in the end, who both had merits, really, obviously. And we thought Ray Wilson definitely had the better, he had a lovely voice, we thought we could really use this. But he did come on board a little bit late, and some of the songs were sort of written before he came on, and I think we'd have done it differently, because his voice is just different. It didn't necessarily lend itself to some of the things we'd written. We'd written, as we normally had in the past, for a voice more like Phil's, and a few things didn't work so well that way. And one or two things we were able to get him to kind of just sort of improvise along a bit and then use some of what he sang and involve them in a bit like we've done in the past. And I think those are some of the more successful songs. I think when we were writing, the one drawback we had, I think, writing as a two-piece, as if we were a three-piece, I think was quite difficult to do, looking back on it. I mean, obviously I write on my own all the time, as does Mike, and you do all this sort of stuff, and it's not a problem really, because then you can go anywhere you like and you can do anything you like. When it's only two of you, sort of one of you's got to kind of hold down the kind of the riff and sort of whatever it is you're doing, some basis to kind of to work with, and the other guy's got to do everything. And if he runs out of ideas, it's a bit like nothing happens. Whereas if there's three of you, and one guy's going, another guy suddenly takes over and does a bit, another guy does this, and it works very well. And I think although, there were some moments that worked very well on this record, I think, a couple of times we did find that. I think it's slightly less, there's less musicality on this album than there might have been just for that reason, I think. Dramatic kind of traditional Genesis, I suppose, in terms of the chords and the rhythm and everything about it. And then, vocal that's sort of, which is sort of, again, not rare for us, which doesn't really repeat all that much. Perhaps echoed slightly more earlier Genesis, this sort of feeling with Ray had a very dark voice, And I think towards the end of the song, it really lifts. It gets fantastic sound about it. I'd like to have lifted a little bit earlier on. I think that's my only feeling about that song. It needed to lift a little earlier. But it's still, I think, it's still sort of song I'm proud of. I think that works really well. Near as a drummer, I mean, he just he was just a great sort of, he made the drums sound loud, which is something Phil does very well, actually. But not every drummer can do it. It's a funny thing. You think, well, hit him louder, but it's not like that. And he was incredibly tight, really sort of, and really there's the sort of riffs that kind of really sort of smacked into the groove. I mean, I don't know. I've been fortunate in my career. I've worked with a lot of really good drummers, not outside Genesis as well, and everything. But I mean, he stands up with all of them. He's a very good drummer and just fantastic sound. And live, he worked great. And given the fact that he was we kind of got used to hearing Phil and Chester up there sometimes, and sometimes Nia was doing stuff on his own which they'd done together, and I think it actually sounds very good. He was a very, very solid man to have behind you, and I think he was really good. Don't talk back to me. Small Talk, which is not a song that I particularly remember after the album. I didn't really think about it very much. But when we were doing the remixes recently, and we did the 5.1 version, I thought, Christ, this is a really good song. I really enjoyed it, almost more than all the others. And just shows really. Songs can sort of come out of the woodwork and you think, this is good. It's a song again which started off with a little. I just did a sample of something Mike played and then sort of did it and got this little riff which sounded really good, and then screwed it up to make this sort of very thin sound, and we sort of wrote the song around this riff. And I think it still sounds pretty good to me. That really. In musical terms, I think there's lots of good moments on this record. I think it stands up very well. I'd like to have worked with Ray in a studio from the word go. It would have been interesting to try to write for that voice with a different approach. And I mean, we did even consider the idea of perhaps using both Nia and particularly Nia, I think, and Anthony Drennan as well. And I think he's a great guitarist. I really liked different kind of guitarist to what we've used in the past, but it's still a really, really lovely style. And the idea of using them a bit on the album as well, rather than sticking with just the three, would have been quite an interesting thing to do. But there comes a point sometimes you've got to sort of the writing seemed to be on the wall, I think, and we just sort of read it and thought it's probably time to sort of just give it a bit of a break. I was quite interested and excited about it, actually. I think particularly, obviously we've done the whole lot now, so I mean, the earlier albums, there's so much you can do to them. I said we did some of these albums in a very short period of time, and we were very rushed when it came to the mixing stage, and things just got, were not done satisfactorily, really, because you didn't have the time. So for a start, you can go back to these things, and you could even just remixing them in stereo would change, make them better. When we were doing these remixes, though, we took as our kind of brief that it shouldn't change them. They shouldn't really change. They should sound like they did, but just better. So you don't want people to come in here and say, oh, that's completely different. You just want people to hear it and think, God, that sounds great, but it still sounds like the song I know. So we're not trying to change balance or anything particularly. You might obviously with 5.1, because you can position things all round. You can sort of, you hear things you didn't hear before necessarily. So you just got to make certain you get that sort of, the effect right. There are moments when you do gimmicky things, like you put a voice out the back, things like that. But you try to keep those little bit for shock value and things, you know. And there are other things you put out the back. I mean, some of the percussive things sound really nice just coming out of a sort of strange area. But the resultant mix shouldn't change too much. And I've been quite closely involved in this all the way through, actually. I mean, Nick Davis has been the man who's done it, who's been our most recent engineer-producer. And he's been kind of doing the bulk of the work. But I've come in at the end of every song, either sort of, depending on when he went, sometimes earlier, depending a little bit on the song and how he feels about it. And then we'll kind of try to think about the whole group, not just about the keyboards. Obviously, put the keyboards a bit louder, you know. I just really enjoyed it all, really. I just found that, you know, you'd hear things on these songs you couldn't remember, really. And then you go back to the original, they are sort of there, but not as loud as you might want it. And backing harmonies, you know, you can just get everything just sort of to sound so nice. And even when you go back and then make a stereo out of that new 5.1 mix, just about every case it sounds better than the original, just because you've had the time to do it. Certainly everything up to and including Duke, that's the case, I think. The albums after that, the technology being better and everything, it's less of a change. But I think particularly the albums, you know, well, the albums within this grouping, the 5 albums we're talking about here, particularly the first 4 of those, I think, you know, just changed so much. Because what's on tape, particularly on albums like Wind and Wuthering and Duke, is really good, I think, and this just really brings it out now. What we didn't want to do is to suddenly make it all contemporary 2006 kind of sounding, you know. The idea is to try and keep the character, so it still sounds, if it's a 1976 album, it still sounds like 1976, but you make it sound, you know, good within that kind of parameter. Well, I think the 5.1 mix always brings something to the thing, and I think the more expansive pieces benefit from it more than anything, you know. You know, the dominoes and the tonights, because you can place things, you know, they sound really, really good. Mama, I think, sounds really good now, you know. In terms of obviously the stereos are less different on this than they were on the previous ones because the quality of the final recordings was better. But it gave us a chance to revisit them, and I think some of them we've been able to do a bit more too, which is quite fun. But you know, I think the 5.1, I mean, if you've got the system, and I suppose if you've bought this, you're hearing me speak, you may well have a system that can play it back. It just gives you something, another dimension completely, and you can hear things, you know, the way you can do it, you can put things out the back, and you just give people a different experience, I think, and songs that you may think you know and you love, you know, you hear them again, and although they not sound radically different, it just takes you somewhere else, I think. And we had a lot of fun doing it. I mean, it's been a lot of work, you know. I mean, I know Nick's done the majority of the work, but I've been involved in every track, really, because perhaps I care more than the others, I don't know, but I just felt that someone had to be there from the group every time because there were little things that got lost otherwise. And I was, you know, I've really enjoyed the whole experience. There's been so many good moments on there, and I think I was very happy to do it.
Well, obviously the 5.1 remixes and also the stereo remixes have more to offer perhaps on this batch of albums than any of the other ones we've done, just because, you know, the early albums were done very fast in the studio. We didn't get much time to sort of mix in and everything like that. So you can really revisit them and explore them and separate stuff out to a much greater degree. And I think the transformation, obviously we had some restrictions on Trespass because it was recorded on an 8-track machine, so you don't have as much ability to position things as you do on the later ones. But then from Nursery Cryme was a 16-track. And you can then start to spread the stuff out. And I mean, I think particularly on, well, all the albums really, but particularly I suppose those Nursery Cryme and Foxtrot, you're able to kind of just suddenly find space in there that wasn't there before. And another song that to me sounds wonderful in 5.1 is Cinema Show, the first part. I just think that's the way the guitars sort of come in and out, and everything is really good. And then the voices too. There's a bit in the middle of that, which is a bit sort of Crosby, Stills and Nash, which sounds almost better than Crosby, Stills and Nash. Dare I say it? No. But it's just the way it works is lovely, and there's something you can do. I think something with 5.1, one of the best things actually is the position, be able to position the guitars all over the place, because we always use quite a few of them. You know, normally, often on those songs, there's 3 of us playing guitar, and it does produce a wonderful sound, I think. I've enjoyed the whole process. I mean, I've been there every time with every track, helping or hindering Nick, as the case may be, really. No, really just trying to give the group's point of view, because sometimes some songs end up further away than they should be, and other songs end up sounding great straight off. So revisiting these things, it's great for me, because I know a lot of these songs I hadn't heard for a long time, actually, and I had a sort of preconceived ideas about them as well. I remember particularly thinking Harlequin was a very weak song, but hearing it in that recently, I thought that's just a pretty good song. You know, so it's quite nice to be able to do that and to reassess what you feel and to explore your past, really. it's kind of strange because I've been, it's been a sort of 2-year process of going through all these things and you're reliving your past. But you hear, as overall one ends up being, quite proud of the stuff.